Hello. Today I'm showing you how to play chess, and I'll tell you rules, basics about board and pieces, parts of a game, etc. So let's get started. So firstly, let me introduce chess. Chess, as we know it today, was born out of the Indian game chaturanga before the 600s AD, eventually evolved into what we know as chess around the 16th century. Chess is a two-player game. One is called white and the other black. So now let's talk about the board. It's an 8x8 grid containing 64 squares, and it has to be placed in such a manner that each player's bottom right square has to be in the lighter or white color. Now let's talk about pieces. So there are a total 16 pieces for each side. 8 pawns placed on the second row of each side. 2 rooks placed in corners, 2 knights next to the rooks. Yes, it's called a knight, not a horse. 2 bishops, 1 queen, and a king. And kings and queens are placed F facing each other. The player having white pieces always moves first and makes 1 move, then black plays 1 move. Each player will make alternate moves like this until the game ends. Now let's talk about pieces separately. Firstly, rooks. They move in straight lines. So if I place it here, it moves on square highlighted with red. And if there is a piece in these highlighted squares, it can capture it and remove it from the board and occupies that square. Bishop. These move in diagonals. So if it's on this square, it can go on squares highlighted. And if there is a piece in these squares, it can capture it. Queens. These are called the most powerful pieces on the board because they can move both like rooks and bishops, which means it can move any number of squares vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. From this position, it can go any square highlighted and capture pieces. Knights. These move in a shape of L, moving 2 squares in one direction, except diagonal and 1 square like this. In this position, the knight can move in highlighted squares. It is the only piece that can jump over pieces, meaning if there were any pieces here, the knight could simply jump and move. Pawns. These are the most complicated pieces. They only move in one direction. If it's their first move, then can move 1 or 2 squares in one direction. Otherwise, these can only move 1 square. Suppose that this pawn moves 2 squares and this one moves 1 square. These highlighted pawns could only move 1 square forward. Now if white moves this pawn 2 square forward and black also moves 2 square, you might be thinking that this pawn can now capture this pawn, but he cannot, because they move in one way and capture in other way. Remember, pawns can only capture pieces diagonally in front of them, and they cannot capture pieces directly in front of them. In fact, this pawn simply cannot move or capture. He is stuck and has no legal moves. However, this pawn does. This pawn can move forward like this, or he can capture 1 square diagonal. But what's going to happen if this pawn gets to the back rank or row? Or this black pawn gets to the back rank or row? Well, what happens is something called pawn promotion. And what that means is that the pawn simply turns into a queen, rook, knight, or a bishop. You can promote it to any of these 4 pieces. It's completely your choice. Now let's talk about the most important piece, and that is the king. The objective of chess is to checkmate the king. The king is price because if you lose the king, you'll lose the game. The king moves on time at a square in any direction. In this position, it can go to the highlighted squares. Whenever a move results in the opponent's king being threatened, then the attacking player must say check. So the term check simply refers to the king being attacked. For example, in this position, it's black to move. And if the rook goes to e8, then the white king is in check. He's being attacked and needs to do something about it. When you're in check, there are three ways you can try to get out of it. You can try to move to a safe square, or block the check, or simply capture the checking piece. In this position, white can do all three. He can move to a safe square. All these highlighted squares are safe. The king can move to any of these. You can also block the check, and by block, I mean to place a piece in between the checking piece and the king. Here, you can block the check with your bishop like this, or you can capture the checking piece like this. If you're in check and there is no move to protect the king, then the attacking player declares checkmate. The game is over, and he wins. For example, in this position, if the black rook moves to h1, white is checkmated. He cannot go to any of these three squares because the black king guards them. He cannot go to any of these two squares because the black rook guards them. The bishop is not in the position to capture the rook or block the check. For these three reasons, the king is checkmate and the game is over. Sometimes, a chess game can also end in a draw. Let's first look at a draw by stalemate. In this position, if the queen moves to g3, this is considered a stalemate position, or a drawn position. Stalemate occurs under the following conditions. It's your turn to move. Your king is not in check, and you have no legal moves for any of you pieces. In this position, it's white to move. White is not in check and has no legal moves. All of these three squares are covered by the black queen, and this pawn is not able to move. This is an example of stalemate. If it's a king and knight versus king, there's no way to win and the game is drawn. Similarly, if there was a bishop instead of knight, the game was drawn too. And of course, if we have just kings, they can't move next to each other, so it's a draw. A game could also be drawn by a threefold repetition, which means if an exact same position is repeated 3 times during the game, it is a draw. For example, in this position, it's white to move. It's the first time we see this position. After white moves, then black plays the bishop, and white goes like this, and black goes back. This is now a second time we see this position. And if it happens one more time, after a few more moves just like this, then it is the third instance of the same position. And hence, the game is drawn by threefold repetition. There's also a special move in chess called castling, and it involves the king and the rook. It's the only time you can move 2 of your pieces in one turn. Here's what it looks like. In this position, white can move the king 2 squares towards the h-rook, and the rook is now going to be placed on the other side, right next to the king. That's kingside castling. Now similarly, if the king moves 2 squares towards the a-rook, and the rook is placed on the other side of the king, right next to it like that, that's queenside castling. Now there are some conditions which must be met in order to castle successfully. It must be the king's first move. It must be that rook's first move, and there should not be any pieces in between the king and rook. In this position, black rook is on e5, and the white king is in check. And when you are in check, you cannot castle out of check. That is one rule that you must follow. You also cannot castle through check. In this position, for example, white cannot castle queenside since the rook is controlling this square. So you need to remember these 3 conditions to castle. So this was a beginner chess tutorial. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment section. So I'm technical and PowerPoint Akshat. See you with another video next time. Ciao.